All right, guys, we're back with another reaction here. We have Napoleonic Wars Battle for France Endgame. We're getting down to the last couple videos here of the main series, and then I'll move on to the marshals. Um, and the last one we saw, the battle at Leipzig, it was crazy, and now we're just kind of moving on to, I suppose, the battle for France, really. He's kind of pressed on all sides, back against the wall, and let's see what Napoleon can do.
In October 1813, Napoleon had suffered his heaviest ever defeat at Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations. Surviving French forces, exhausted, sick and demoralized, retreated to the River Rhine and prepared to defend France from invasion. But in November, the armies of the Sixth Coalition paused their advance, and Austrian Foreign Minister Metternich offered peace terms.
Yeah, we've seen Metternich before. He seems like a very capable guy, very important guy in Austrian diplomacy. I am surprised a little bit that they would offer peace terms after all this fighting. They must have had, I guess, a good reason to. Maybe they were tired of fighting too. But let's see what they offer him.
The Frankfurt proposals would allow Napoleon to keep his throne if France returned to her so-called natural frontiers. It was the best offer Napoleon was likely to get, now that his back was to the wall, and all Europe's great powers were united against him. Even so, he did not accept the terms. He merely agreed to reopen negotiations. To the Allies, and many in France itself, it proved that Napoleon would not listen to reason.
Yeah.
The war went on, and by January 1814, Napoleon's situation looked even worse. Many of his besieged garrisons in the east were starved into surrender. Marshal Davout, with 34,000 men in Hamburg, was now besieged. Denmark, one of France's last allies, was invaded by Bernadotte's Swedish army and made to join the coalition.
I haven't really heard much about Denmark at all, even though a lot of these battles are pretty close to Denmark, or kind of around that area. Was Denmark sort of not really a powerful nation at the time? And who was ruling Denmark? Was it a king? I'm assuming it was a king, but was it like the old type of ruling like they did in like Scandinavia in like the Viking era? Or did they have kind of an established nation, a modern nation like the rest of Europe?
French troops evacuated the Netherlands, which reasserted its independence after nearly 20 years of French control. In Italy, Eugene's army faced a new enemy, Joachim Murat, king of Naples, now marching north
This guy.
with 30,000 men to honor his new alliance with the Sixth Coalition. In Paris, Napoleon responded to the crisis with a series of extreme measures. Property taxes doubled, state salaries and pensions suspended.
Wow.
300,000 new conscripts called up from a country already exhausted by 20 years of war.
It's sad, really, really sad.
He ordered the release of Pope Pius, under French house arrest for the last 5 years, to try to shore up his support in Italy.
That's interesting. How much, at this time, how much sway did the Pope have? I know obviously the Pope was, I guess still today is a respected position, I suppose, on religious, for Catholics on religious matters. But like in 1814, was it the same type of power that the Pope had, during like the Holy Roman Empire time, or like, the Crusades times? You know, what was the level of sway the Pope even really had?
He even agreed to release Fernando, the Bourbon king of Spain, to take up his throne in exchange for peace between France and Spain.
Why?
A condition that Fernando was in no position to honor.
Well, right. I mean, the people of Spain would probably not sit well with that, even if he could honor that.
But these concessions were too little, far too late. In January, 2 coalition armies crossed the Rhine into France. Blücher's army of Silesia and Schwarzenberg's army of Bohemia.
Wow.
Outnumbered French forces in their path could only fall back. On the 25th of January, Napoleon said farewell to his wife and son at the Tuileries Palace before leaving for the front. He would never see either of them again.
Wow. That's sad.
With just 70,000 men, he faced odds of 4-1. Most of his troops were raw conscripts, some without uniforms, many just learning how to hold a musket. But for the first time in years, Napoleon's army was so small that he'd be able to exercise direct command over all its movements. The result would be one of the most audacious and brilliant campaigns in history.
Okay. If the enemy are foolish enough to cross the Rhine, I will march to meet them. Then you will see the meaning of the word debacle. Wow. I like that quote. He's basically saying it's going to be a catastrophe for them if they cross. I'm going to go back to Napoleon and his wife and child. As a father myself, that's a horrifying thought, to never see my child again. Did Napoleon have no contact at all, or just not seeing them? Was he able to write to them wherever they went? To kind of get information on how they're doing? Or was it just that he had no contact again whatsoever?
The battle for France would be fought east of Paris, mostly across Champagne, a flat region divided by the rivers Marne and Seine and their tributaries. In late January, fields were dusted with snow and roads quickly turned to mud. Napoleon learned that the coalition armies were widely scattered, with part of Blücher's army near Napoleon's old college at Brienne. The emperor advanced rapidly, hoping to trap and destroy part of Blücher's army. But after a hard day's fighting that cost both sides 3,000 casualties, Blücher was able to retreat towards Schwarzenberg's army. That evening, Napoleon was nearly skewered by a charging Cossack, saved only by General Gorgo's good shooting.
Napoleon escapes death a lot, apparently.
As Napoleon tried to work out the enemy's movements, Blücher, heavily reinforced by Schwarzenberg, made a surprise attack at La Rothière. Allied troops advanced through swirling snow to assault the village, defiantly held by young French conscripts. One was so inexperienced that Marshal Marmont had to personally show him how to load his musket during the battle.
Wow.
By late afternoon, Wreder's Bavarian corps was falling on Napoleon's flank. Heavily outnumbered, Napoleon had no option but to retreat, having lost 5,000 casualties and 73 guns abandoned in the thick mud. The Allies' frontal attacks meant their losses were greater, but by combining their armies, they defeated Napoleon on French soil for the first time.
Right.
Believing Napoleon would now retreat towards Paris, the Allies decided to advance along 2 routes to ease pressure on the roads. Blücher would take a northern route along the Marne. Schwarzenberg would follow the Seine.
I don't think that's a good idea. As we've seen in previous videos on Napoleon, he seems to do really well when he can kind of get you all together, or not all together, like get you, your army up here, your army up here, your army down here. Like you have your army, but you're kind of taking different, wings of it. So he does really well, like defeating one wing, or one side of it, and then going to the other side and defeating that one. So maybe it's hard to. I guess I don't know the logistics of it, but maybe it's more difficult for them to combine their forces.
But dividing their armies again would play right into Napoleon's hands.
Yeah, I mean, the study of it has given me a greater idea of his genius than any other. The Duke of Wellington on Napoleon's campaign. Okay, so what was his name? Arthur Wellesley? Yeah, the Duke of Wellington. Okay, so Napoleon has not lost any of his tactical skill, obviously. So I'm wondering why the Allies abandoned the Trachenberg plan, I think it was, where they kind of avoided fighting him.
After 2 days to reorganize, Napoleon continued his retreat to Nogent, where he learned that the Allies had split their armies. Not only that, they were advancing at different speeds. The aggressive Blücher racing ahead, while the more cautious Schwarzenberg lagged behind. Leaving Oudinot and Victor to guard the Seine bridges and delay Schwarzenberg, Napoleon raced north through mud and rain with 30,000 men. The army of Silesia was strung out on the march, oblivious to the danger it was in. First, Napoleon fell on General Ossouffiev's Russian 9th Corps at Champaubert, destroying it, taking its commander and 2,000 men prisoner. The next morning, he marched on General Osten-Sacken's force near Montmiral. This was a much larger force, with 2 infantry and 1 cavalry corps, and was expecting support from York's Prussian 1st Corps. But the Prussians were late, and Sacken's troops could not withstand the French onslaught. At this desperate hour, the Emperor's elite Old Guard were no longer held back, but were often thrown into the thick of the fighting.
Yeah.
By the end of the day, Napoleon had inflicted another 3,500 casualties.
What an amazing artwork, though, too, by the way. Just want to shout that out. Like, I love this art.
Twice his own losses, and the Allies were in rapid retreat. Napoleon had ordered Marshal MacDonald to cut off the enemy's escape by seizing the Marne Bridge at Chateau Thierry. But York's Prussians got there first. The next day, Napoleon could only batter their rear guard as the enemy fled across the Marne, destroying the bridge behind them. Sending Marshal Mortier to rebuild the bridge and continue the pursuit, Napoleon doubled back to rejoin Marmont, who had been left to keep watch on Blücher. Napoleon attacked at Vauchamp, using General Grouchy's cavalry to outflank Blücher's army, which was soon in headlong retreat. A merciless French pursuit inflicted 6,000 Prussian and Russian casualties.
What?
Napoleon lost just 600 men.
That's wild.
Napoleon had taken on an enemy army almost twice his size and beaten it 4 times in just 6 days.
That's crazy, dude. 600 to 6,000. 600 to 3,000. Montmoral's a little closer. Chateau Thierry, 500 to... Yeah, I mean, that's crazy. But the thing is, the Allies still have more people overall. Like, there's still an entire another army out there under Schwarzenberg. So, I mean,
Blücher had lost an estimated 15,000 casualties in battle, and another 15,000 in smaller engagements, as stragglers or deserters. For now, the army of Silesia had been scattered and neutralized. But in the south, Marshals Victor and Oudinot had not been able to prevent Schwarzenberg's army of Bohemia from crossing the Seine in 3 places. Austrian troops were now just 40 miles from Paris. Leaving Mortier and Marmont to keep watch on Blücher, Napoleon raced south. Schwarzenberg, alarmed by news of Blücher's defeat and of Napoleon's approach, immediately ordered a retreat. It was too late for Wittgenstein's advance guard, routed at Mormant with 2,000 casualties. Napoleon sent Victor's Second Corps to seize the bridge at Montereau, but was so infuriated by its slow progress that he sacked Victor and gave his corps to General Gérard.
wow. Okay.
The next day, at the Battle of Montereau, the French drove the Allied Württemberg Corps back across the river, with 30% losses. According to some accounts, the Emperor sighted the French cannon himself, as he had at Lodi 18 years before.
Crazy.
Napoleon had the Allies on the run. But how long could it last?
Yeah. Recollect what your military position is. If we act with military and political prudence, how can France resist a just peace demanded by 600,000 warriors? Let her if she dare. British Foreign Secretary Lord Castlereagh to Metternich. Yeah. I mean, like I was just saying a little bit ago, the Allies still have the numerical advantage. Napoleon has a tactical advantage, I think, obviously. But it's when you're outnumbered almost every battle, eventually, I think that will catch up to you.
Even as fighting continued, negotiations between France and the coalition reopened at Châtillon-sur-Seine on the 5th of February. The Allied terms were now more severe. A return to France's frontiers of 1791, which meant the additional loss of Belgium, a humiliation that Napoleon refused to accept. Instead, he tried to revive the Frankfurt proposals, hoping to play for time and to split the coalition, whose war aims varied from Britain's hard line to Austria's more ambiguous position. But this hope was thwarted by British Foreign Secretary Lord Castlereagh. On the 1st of March, he persuaded the Allies to sign the Treaty of Chaumont. In it, Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Great Britain agreed to keep 150,000 troops in the field and not to negotiate separately with France, while Britain added the sweetener of a £5 million subsidy to be shared among the Allies. The treaty's secret articles specified common war aims, including the future independence of the German states, Switzerland and Italy, while Spain was to be returned to the Bourbons and Holland to the House of Orange.
Okay.
The four powers even agreed that once they'd defeated Napoleon, they'd form a 20-year defensive alliance to maintain peace in Europe.
Oh, wow.
A sign of their newfound commitment to each other. A split in the coalition had been Napoleon's last, best hope for a favorable peace. That was gone. And news from across the country was bleak. French cities were surrendering to the Allies without a fight. Nancy, Dijon, and Mâcon had all fallen. In the south, Wellington defeated Marshal Soult at Orthez, forcing him to fall back on Toulouse. 2 weeks later, as British troops approached the city of Bordeaux, it declared loyalty to France's Bourbon kings. The mayor himself rode out to greet the British, bearing a white cockade, the sign of Bourbon allegiance.
So basically, the royalists, right? That's like the same. This would be the same people as the royalists were during like the revolt, the Vendée revolt. They're basically pledging allegiance back to the king or whoever the king is now, instead of Napoleon. Correct?
Napoleon's hope for a nation in arms to resist the Allies had not materialized. Allied troops, particularly Cossacks, often robbed French civilians and committed some atrocities. French peasants took revenge when they could, but there was no guerrilla war to mirror what French troops had encountered in Spain or Russia. The chief desire among ordinary French people was for peace, at almost any price.
Dangers crowded upon him, encompassed him, oppressed him from every side, but he sought to escape from them by misrepresenting them to himself. Wow. That's a very powerful quote, and I think not only does it apply maybe in Napoleon's situation, but a lot of times it applies to all of us too. There are things that happen in our lives and we don't want to deal with them. So we lie to ourselves about them. In the end, though, it usually comes back to bite us.
Any talk of Napoleon's defeat in late February was premature. The French Emperor was driving Schwarzenberg's army of Bohemia before him, even though it was twice his size. But Schwarzenberg scrambled to safety behind the River Aube. Napoleon knew he had to land another decisive blow soon, so turned his attention back to Blücher. After an aborted attempt to join forces with Schwarzenberg, Blücher had decided to resume his advance on Paris, gathering reinforcements en route, and with only Marmont and Mortier's weak corps to oppose him. Leaving Marshal MacDonald in command in the south, Napoleon set off to intercept Blücher, covering 60 miles in 3 days along terrible roads choked with mud. At Napoleon's approach, Blücher retreated across the Marne, burning the bridges behind him. 24 hours later, they'd been rebuilt by French engineers, and Napoleon was poised to crush Blücher against the Aisne River, because the major crossing point at Soissons was held by a Franco-Polish garrison. But after just a day's fighting, the garrison commander at Soissons tamely surrendered, allowing Blücher to escape. Napoleon continued his pursuit across the Aisne, still hoping to cut off the army of Silesia. But at Craon, he encountered Russian troops in a strong defensive position. The Russians fought stubbornly. The French finally forced the enemy to withdraw, but only at the cost of 6,000 casualties, including many irreplaceable veterans from Napoleon's guard.
Can't afford those losses.
Napoleon pushed on to Laon. But by now, Blücher had concentrated his forces, 98,000 troops in all.
Dang.
And outnumbered Napoleon 2-1. French attacks were repulsed, while Marmont's corps was caught off guard by a late Allied counterattack and routed. Napoleon was lucky to avoid a much heavier defeat. Blücher, usually aggressive to the point of recklessness, was unwell and had been told Napoleon's army was twice as big as it was, leading him to act with unusual caution.
Okay.
Laon was a heavy blow to Napoleon. 6,500 casualties he could not afford. Undaunted, he fell back to Soissons, and after a brief moment to reorganize, he marched on the city of Reims, which had just fallen, to Saint-Priest's Russian corps. In a whirlwind assault, Napoleon retook the city. Saint-Priest himself was mortally wounded, his corps routed. Meanwhile, in the south, Schwarzenberg had resumed his offensive as soon as he found out Napoleon had gone north.
Well, yeah, because I mean, like these battles Napoleon is fighting is kind of just delaying the inevitable, really. Like I was saying earlier, there's just too many men to fight. Both of the armies are larger than his by double digits, twice as much. I mean, Napoleon, he's a genius, I mean, obviously, but it's very difficult. You're fighting two massive armies that are far apart from each other without numerical advantage. You don't have any cavalry advantage. You don't have artillery advantage. And you're fighting these smaller battles that end up wearing down your forces. You lose 2,000 here, 3,000 here, 5,000 here. You don't really have anything to replace them with.
In heavy fighting, he'd driven Oudinot and MacDonald back from the River Aube. 5 days later, the Allies had recaptured Troyes, as MacDonald retreated behind the River Seine. Now, after 4 days to rest and reorganize his battered army, Napoleon was coming south once more. Schwarzenberg, emboldened by news of Napoleon's defeat at Laon, decided that this time he would stand and fight. Napoleon advanced on Arcis-sur-Aube, ignoring reports that the enemy was not retreating as he believed, but gathering for battle. As heavy fighting broke out, Napoleon still believed he faced only the enemy rearguard. It was a nasty surprise to discover that he faced the entire might of the army of Bohemia. 28,000 men against 80,000.
Oh my gosh.
In desperate fighting, Napoleon personally rallied fleeing troops and exposed himself to enemy fire, having his horse killed under him by an exploding shell.
Wow.
But the odds were too great. At the end of the second day, Napoleon was forced to order the retreat.
Yeah. I sought a glorious death, disputing foot by foot the soil of the country. The balls flew around me, my clothes were pierced, but none reached me. I mean, give it to Napoleon too. He's not only is he tactically smart, he actually has a, which we don't really see too much in these videos, a very strong sense of courage and belief, in his men and in himself. And obviously, he puts himself in harm's way a lot. Has his horse killed under him, getting shot everywhere, and, just nothing, like he said, nothing ended him. It was almost like preordained that nothing, like he couldn't get injured during a battle. But it is, to me, astounding that he wasn't killed in earlier battles.
Napoleon believed his army was now too weak to take on the Allies directly, so he decided to change strategy. He would march into the rear of the Allied armies, join up with some of his isolated garrisons, and cut the enemy's lines of communication, forcing them to abandon their advance on Paris. But the Allies, until now always one step behind Napoleon, had just received crucial information. Talleyrand, the most brilliant French diplomat of the age,
this guy,
and the most slippery.
This guy didn't go to the Ottoman Empire like he said he was gonna. Little scoundrel.
He'd served France's monarchy, the Revolution, then Napoleon, until in 1807 he fell out irrevocably with the emperor over foreign policy. He now believed that Napoleon was dragging France into ruin and worked behind the scenes to ensure his downfall.
Little scallywag.
Paris, he wrote to the Russian Emperor Alexander at Allied headquarters, informing him that in the capital, support for Napoleon was crumbling, and the city's defenses had been completely neglected. He urged the Allies to march immediately on Paris, without allowing Napoleon to distract them. Talleyrand's information was confirmed when the Allies intercepted a report from Napoleon's chief of police, General Savary, meant for the Emperor. The treasury, arsenals, and powder stores are empty. We are completely at the end of our resources. The population is discouraged and discontented, wishing peace at any price. As Napoleon advanced on Saint-Dizier, the Allies sent General Witzengerode and 10,000 cavalry to harass his army and to screen their own movements. Then began their march on Paris. At Fère-Champenoise, they collided with Marmont and Mortier's corps, advancing to join Napoleon. An entire National Guard division, 5,000 men, was virtually wiped out as the marshals suffered a crushing defeat.
Yeah. What do you do?
Napoleon feared that the fall of Paris would be a fatal blow to his regime. His political authority and ability to wage war might not recover. So, when he received news of the Allies' movements, he tore up his plans and ordered a forced march back to Paris, intending to lead its defense in person.
Well, to be fair, I mean, his political power and ability to wage war has already been diminished. So, I mean, would it be, I mean, obviously it'd be worse if the Allies took Paris, but you're in a situation right now where it's like, you don't really even have the forces to defend Paris. And according to that report from his chief of police, the people in Paris maybe don't want you back. I don't know. They don't seem too happy.
Napoleon's wife and son were evacuated from the capital, along with most of his ministers. His brother, Joseph, the ex-king of Spain, was in charge of the city's defenses, but had done little.
Wow.
Paris was awash with rumors of treachery and defeat. Marmont and Mortier were able to reach Paris before the Allies, adding their troops to the garrison. It now totaled 37,000 men, including some hardened veterans of the Guard, but many more young conscripts, while a third were part-time soldiers of the National Guard. The Allies had 120,000 seasoned troops outside the city, and given the urgency of taking Paris before Napoleon could intervene, their elite guards and grenadier divisions would lead the way. On the 30th of March, they began their assault from the north.
Wow.
Heavy fighting raged throughout the day. The city's defenders fought bravely, inflicting several thousand casualties on the advancing enemy. But defeat was inevitable.
Yeah.
That night, to save Paris from destruction, Marshal Marmont agreed to surrender the city, on condition the garrison was permitted to leave with its weapons.
Really? So he had the authority to do that? I mean, I can understand why you would do that. You obviously don't want your capital to be ransacked and demolished by artillery and fires and pillaging. Interesting.
At the Hôtel des Invalides, the 71-year-old Marshal Serrurier oversaw the burning of 1,400 flags and standards captured from France's enemies, as well as Frederick the Great's sword and sash.
What?
So they would not fall into Allied hands. Napoleon was just 15 miles from Paris when he was informed of the city's surrender. He sat with his head in his hands for 15 minutes.
Yeah.
On the 31st of March 1814, France's enemies marched into Paris for the first time since the 100 Years' War. Parisian crowds cheered the three Allied monarchs, bringers of peace. Everyone in Paris was suddenly a royalist once more. Above all, they cheered for Emperor Alexander of Russia, now hailed as Europe's savior.
Wow.
Don Cossacks bivouacked on the Champs-Élysées. Allied troops...
What did he just say?
Bivouacked on... Don Cossacks bivouacked on the Champs-Élysées.
John Cossacks bivouacked? I have no clue what that means.
Allied troops generally behaved well. "35 miles away, Napoleon was at Fontainebleau with 36,000 men, all of them hungry and exhausted after their 100-mile forced march. Nevertheless, Napoleon began planning an immediate advance on Paris. But for the first time, he faced unanimous opposition from his ministers and marshals, including Ney, MacDonald, Oudinot, and Berthier. They reminded him of his oath to act for the good of France. He accused them of disloyalty, acting only to save themselves.
Disloyalty. Really? The only one of these guys that's shown any sort of something like that is Murat. The rest of these guys have fought and died for you, man. And you're accusing them of disloyalty? Come on, Napoleon.
They told him the war was lost, and he must abdicate in favor of his son if possible. On the 4th of April, Marshal Marmont surrendered his entire corps to the coalition, which was marched over to the enemy lines against the wishes of many of its officers and men. This was a devastating blow to Napoleon, and encouraged the Allies to reject his offer of a conditional abdication in favor of his son. 2 days later, he abdicated without conditions. The Allied powers having proclaimed that the Emperor Napoleon is the only obstacle to the re-establishment of peace in Europe, the Emperor Napoleon, faithful to his oath, declares that he renounces for himself and his heirs the thrones of France and Italy, and that there is no personal sacrifice, including his life, that he is not ready to make in the interests of France.
Wow. Powerful statement.
Napoleon's abdication was formalized by the Treaty of Fontainebleau, by which he was allowed to keep the title of emperor, become sovereign of the small island of Elba, and retain a bodyguard of 400 men. News came too late to prevent Wellington's attack on Toulouse, leading to a costly and pointless battle with more than 7,000 casualties. The night after his abdication, Napoleon tried to commit suicide, using the poison that had been made for him in Russia in case of capture.
Oh dear.
But it had lost its potency, and he survived. 2 weeks later, Napoleon bade farewell to his old guard at Fontainebleau Palace and began his journey into exile.
I have been wrong maybe in my plans. I have done harm in war. but it is all like a dream. That's pretty deep coming from Napoleon. Having a little retrospective look into his own life.
The Napoleonic Wars, which had raged on land and sea for 11 years, seemed finally at an end. The death toll is unknown, but historians estimate that 2 to 3 million lives were lost across Europe. Most soldiers died not in battle, but from disease. Many thousands were left maimed and disfigured. For most of this period, Napoleon was master of Europe, imposing treaties on humbled enemies, redrawing frontiers, overthrowing old regimes, and making new kings. He was the last figure in history to combine total political power with frontline military genius, in the mold of Alexander and Caesar.
Wow.
But it seemed Napoleon's reign was to end in abject military defeat. However, exile on Elba did not prove to Napoleon's taste. In less than 10 months, he would return to France to fight one last great campaign to reclaim his throne.
Wow. Wow. Crazy, dude. It's just wild to think about that not too long ago he had basically conquered all of Europe. And now it's, obviously with one last battle, it's basically an end. It's weird to think about. But it's a great video. Thank you, Epic History TV. Everybody who works with the channel, the patrons for them, their subs. Thank you guys for subbing and commenting on my channel. I greatly appreciate it. I'm excited to see the last one in the series here and then move on to the marshals. I know you guys have been talking about how the marshals are really, really good. So yeah, thank you guys. Have a good night, good day, wherever you are. Be safe. Please be safe. Wherever you are, whatever you do in life, we want you here with us on this planet. Okay? So do the right thing, make smart choices. See you guys later. Bye.